Okay, so we are going to be talking about this African American civil rights. Again, since I'm just now starting the recording, and some people may pick this up back later, keep in mind that we're going to be covering African American civil rights for the rest of today. We may go about an hour and a half today. Next class period, we'll get into Mexican American civil rights. The class period after that, we will have our fifth and final quiz. Study guide is on Blackboard for that. Right after that, we will have the primary source essay. The documents that you'll want to read ahead of time in preparation for that essay are going to post in Blackboard before the next class period. And let's go ahead and pick up the so we've already gone through the Brown v. Board of Education decision, right? That Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 is going to start the process of desegregating schools. Remember, it's not going to happen right away. It's going to take several years, in some cases over a decade, for this to happen. But now we're going to start going to transportation. And in Montgomery, Alabama, and Alabama in general, we had segregated buses. These are city buses that people take going to work. If you don't have very much money, it's pretty common to use buses. In fact, my grandmother, of course not being African American, but Mexican American, my grandmother lived her whole life without driving. She grew up in near downtown San Antonio, and if it was close, we would walk. Right? I would walk with her several blocks, maybe half a mile or a mile to wherever we were going, and if it was going to be longer than that, then you'd hop on the Via bus and make your way around town. So she went her whole life, 80 plus years without an automobile. So she kind of grew up in this era too. Of course, my grandmother was born in 1917, so she would have been like in her mid-late 30s as we get to this point. But now we're going to talk about Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks was a 42-year-old woman. She had a clean criminal record. That's going to come in handy. She has this Protestant background. That's going to come in handy. And in December 1st of 1955, she takes a seat at the front of the bus. Now, that's okay if the bus is empty. It's not okay if a white person gets on the bus. In Alabama, if a white person gets on the bus, then African Americans have to move to the back of the bus and give up their seat to the white person. Rosa Parks, at the end of the workday, doesn't want to get up. She's done it enough in her life. She's fed up with it. It's been kind of a mounting movement that's been leading up. Other people have actually done this ahead of time. In fact, there was a young lady named Claudette Colvin who was 15 years old who did the exact same thing earlier that year and was arrested for it. But it doesn't really make the waves, right? It's not going to be really big publicity. Now, all this time, there's local groups like the NAACP and others that are looking for somebody who's going to challenge this, to be arrested. But it has to be the right person, right? It can't be a 15-year-old that's pregnant with somebody else's child and the father is a married man. And that's the problem with Claudette Colvin, is that she's a 15-year-old pregnant girl that's impregnated by a married man who had an affair with her. So she's not going to be the ideal candidate, because if she goes to court, then she's going to be portrayed as just a troublemaker, right? Somebody who's not a very ideal citizen. But when you have a 42-year-old person who's just tired at the end of the day and she just wants to keep her seat on the bus, then she becomes a much more sympathetic character. So once Rosa Parks does this, African-American leaders in Montgomery, Alabama, are going to say this is the opportunity. So they create something called the Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA. Now, the MIA, I don't have on the study guide. I may do that in the future, but Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIA, is created just a few days after Rosa Parks is arrested. And they lead this massive bus boycott. So in Montgomery, Alabama, about 75% of bus riders in the mid-1950s were African American. So now we're going to say 3/4 of the bus riders in Montgomery, Alabama are no longer going to ride buses, right? For the vast majority of them. So African Americans across Montgomery are going to stop riding the buses. That's a big hit, right? Any company that loses 3/4 of its revenue is going to be hurting really badly. So this is going to be a big economic or financial hit on the Montgomery bus lines. The person who's going to be elected to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association and lead this boycott is a young 26-year-old man named Martin Luther King Jr. So Martin Luther King Jr., this preacher is nominated or elected to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association, lead this bus boycott. He's an outstanding speaker. He's very well educated. So he's going to be kind of an ideal candidate. And remember, we're in the 1950s, and in the 1950s, as we discussed when we talked about the Eisenhower era, the United States becomes a very Judeo-Christian country, right? By 1960, like 65% of people in the United States belong to a church or synagogue. So having somebody with this Christian pedigree is going to really help out too, because he's going to be able to communicate really well across the country, whether in the north or the south, east or the west. So Martin Luther King Jr. is going to take on this leadership role. Now, he will have his house bombed. Another guy who's a leading member of the movement, a guy named Ralph Abernathy. Don't worry about Abernathy's name. He's going to house his house will also be firebombed. During this 1 year bus boycott, a little over a year, 4 Black Baptist churches in Montgomery would also be burned to the ground. So we see a rise of this violence against African Americans and African American community over the course of this 381-day bus boycott. Now, in addition to this, the African American community has to do something to help out Black bus riders. Right, the people that are riding buses tend not to be the most affluent. Right, they generally don't have automobiles, or if they have an automobile, somebody else in the house is using that automobile. So what you're going to wind up seeing is this organization, that Montgomery Improvement Association, find people who will become taxi drivers and only charge 10 cents for people to transport people from one place to another, really undercutting competition in the area, and they weren't a licensed taxi service. So City of Montgomery then passes a law or ordinance saying that taxis had to charge at least 45 cents. So then you wind up seeing some taxis still break the law. You'll also see carpooling. Montgomery, Alabama is going after all of these illegitimate taxi services. So they're going to be filing a lawsuit against the Montgomery Improvement Association. Meanwhile, we see this court case, Browder versus Gale. Now, this will be decided in 1956. And this Browder versus Gale court decision stated that the Montgomery and Alabama bus lines, city buses, could not be segregated. So this will be a major court decision for city buses in Alabama. So now we cannot segregate city bus lines. Remember, this is just city buses, not interstate buses. We'll get to interstate buses in just a little bit. Now we'll go to this Little Rock 9. Now we're going to get back to education. I'm going to share a video with you as long as I can get it to play okay for you guys. So this will be the first instance that we're going to discuss desegregation in schools. And let me see if I can share this video with you guys. Hopefully there's no problems with it. So I'm going to start working with my Blackboard Collaborate, and then I'll move over to my YouTube in just a moment. And I'm going to switch over to this again. Would somebody do me a favor and let me know if, just speak up because I can't see the chat right now. Let me know if you can see the Little Rock video. Try this again. Okay, we'll try this.
Implementing the Supreme Court ruling to desegregate the nation's public schools was painfully slow. In 1957, 3 years after Brown, schools in the South were still largely segregated. But in September of that year, 9 black teenagers would attempt to enroll in a white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Their action would spark one of the pivotal battles of the civil rights movement and would bring the power of the presidency and the federal government into the dispute. The Brown decision was signed in 1954, and people thought the battle was won. Well, it was just beginning, because the resistance to integration was massive. The Brown versus Board of Education ruling decreed that integration of public schools be implemented with all deliberate speed. The ambiguity of that phrase provided states that practice segregation with an excuse to take their time. The court said in segregation, but all deliberate speed meant deliberate, which means slow. And indeed it was slow. In Arkansas, the Little Rock School Board delayed integration for 3 years. But in September 1957, the time had come. The desegregation of Central High School was about to begin.
My view was that if change was going to come, I wanted to be part of the change.
Ernest Green was one of the 9 black students who volunteered and was then selected by the NAACP and the school board to attend Central High.
Central High School wasn't a foreign entity because we lived near the neighborhood that the school was located. I knew that the building was much larger than the black school that I was attending. We were reminded on things like books for chemistry and science and math, that we received the hand-me-down books from Central after they were obsolete. And I believed, and I think most of us did, that it was going to be relatively quiet. I mean, Little Rock had a reputation as sort of a moderate southern city.
But despite that reputation, the white community in Little Rock overwhelmingly opposed change. And after mass protests, Governor Orville Faubus refused to carry out a plan to integrate.
Labor Day evening, the governor was on television indicating that he was calling out the Arkansas National Guard to prevent us from going to school. And I remember thinking that we really had to try and test that.
The governor said troops were there to prevent violence and to protect life and property. 2 days later, Ernest Green and his fellow students gathered to go to school.
We tried to get across the entrance to the school. We were barred by the National Guard.
On the other side of the building, Elizabeth Eckford, one of the 9 students, was confronted by an angry mob.
The pictures you see of Little Rock of the lone girl with the mob behind her was Elizabeth, and she didn't get the instructions that we would meet on the 14th Street side of the school instead of the 16th Street. And so the picture of Little Rock is pretty much framed in a lot of people's minds by that picture of Elizabeth alone with the mob behind her. And I think when I got home that evening and saw what Elizabeth had gone through, I realized that this was not going to be a tranquil change, that there were people really violently opposed to our going to school there, and were going to try to keep us out.
Despite several attempts by the students to enter the school, they were turned away. Just weeks later, a federal judge ruled that Governor Faubus had illegally used the troops to prevent integration.
Now that a federal court, however, has chosen to substitute its judgment for mine as to how the peace and order should be preserved, I must temporarily, at least, abide.
NBC's John Chancellor was in Little Rock covering the dramatic events.
5 minutes before the governor started speaking, the guard was removed. A few remaining guardsmen gathered in front of the school and were loaded into a truck and driven away. It was just about 3 hours after the court's decision, and it left Central High School unguarded for the first time in 18 days. Governor Faubus then expressed fears of another phase of the problem.
It is inconceivable to me that the parents of the Negro children who have already been enrolled in Central High School by Superintendent Virgil Lawson would want their children in the school now in the situation that prevails. I hope that the NAACP, who instigated, sponsored, and urged the move, will not be so reckless as to push the matter of entering the school until a cooling off period has elapsed.
Problems in Little Rock have passed, at least temporarily, from the courts into the area of human logistics. Now that the National Guard no longer blocks the way of Negro students, the problem is one of getting 9 brown-skinned youngsters past the expected crowds at the high school. Since there is no way of measuring violence in advance, it seems certain that the Negroes will first have to gauge the size and the temper of the crowds before they can move. Therefore, I think it's very unlikely that they will try to enter the building tomorrow, but it is absolutely certain that Negro students will enter the high school sometime this week.
And a few days later, they did, through a side door.
We went to school for half a day, I think on the 23rd of September. And that was when the mob looked as if they were going to break through the police barrier.
When a mob outside learned the students were already inside, chaos ensued. NBC's Herbert Kaplow reported the incident.
State and local police were unable that day before to control a mob which reacted in bitter violence on learning that 9 Negroes had entered the school as students. A couple of weeks earlier, state militia under Wallace control had barred the Negroes from the school. Now, on Black Monday, September 23rd, the 9 Negroes went in but were asked to leave 3 hours later in a move to soothe the mob.
The situation had become so out of control that on September 24th, 3 weeks after the crisis began, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent 1,000 members of the Army's 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock and federalized the Arkansas National Guard.
I have today issued an executive order directing the use of troops under federal authority to aid in the execution of federal law at Little Rock, Arkansas.
It was a classic moment of the federal authority, president confronting the local state authority, the governor. And the governor was right. He had all sorts of support to continue segregation. But President Eisenhower, to his credit, had the moral courage to say, this has to end.
I could have spoken from Rhode Island, of where I have been staying recently. I felt that in speaking from the house of Lincoln, of Jackson, and of Wilson, my words would better convey both the sadness I feel in the action I was compelled today to make, and the firmness with which I intend to pursue this course until the orders of the federal court at Little Rock can be executed without unlawful interference.
The next day, September 25th, the black students returned to the school.
We had a Jeep with soldiers and machine gun mount in front, a Jeep machine gun mount and soldiers in the back of the station wagon. We pulled up in front of Central High School. There was a cordon of soldiers that surrounded us, and we walked up the steps into Central High School. You certainly knew that anybody watching this had to feel that the United States government was going to support the rights of 9 African-American students to go to the school of their choice.
As events unfolded, NBC News provided live coverage.
We're watching to see now whether there's any obvious reaction from white students who are already in the building. We have seen 3 come out. But at the moment, all is quiet. There is no further movement here.
Again, NBC's Herb Kaplow.
An hour later, after onlookers ignored requests to move on, troops dispersed them. One resistor was struck, another nicked by a bayonet. The next night, Wallace broadcast condemnation of what he considered a military occupation.
We are now an occupied territory. Evidence of the naked force of the federal government is here apparent in these unsheathed bayonets in the backs of schoolgirls.
Central High and the Little Rock 9 struggled through their first year of integrated schooling.
The students that tried to befriend us, and there were a few initially, were really harassed and ostracized as much as we were. It was a real reign of terror. It was the relationship between the 9 of us that really allowed us to endure.
At the end of the school year, May 1958, Ernest Green, the only senior of the group, became the first black student to graduate from Central High.
We knew that this was breaking ground for other young people coming along. This was a bigger deal than just going to class each day, and that if we succeeded at it, we just might, add something, widen an opportunity, increase an option for another young man or woman to come behind us.
Okay, we get back in my sharing real quick and switch back real. Okay, do you guys hear that okay? Just want to make sure that that was coming through. Can't hear or see. Yes, it did come through. Okay, very good. Thank you, Ms. Blazek. Very good. All right, let me go back to my files again real quick. Okay, so that's the Little Rock 9. Daisy Bates, I have her name up there. She's the person that was that organized the whole event. Her name is not on the study guide. She won't come up, but she worked for the NAACP in that area in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, it winds up being a really rough year for the students who attend. Let me see. I think I've got my camera blocked over here. Yeah, winds up being a rough year for those students who did attend. One of the girls was pushed down a flight of stairs. Another one of the girls that was part of the Little Rock 9 had a flask of acid thrown at her face while she was there. So it was a really rough year for those 9. Of course, Ernest Green did graduate. Make sure you know Orville Falbus was that governor that was discussed in the video. And next year, when 1958-59 school year came up, Orville Falbus didn't want to deal with this again. He did not want the schools to be integrated in Little Rock, Arkansas. So in order to stop the school from integrating in 1958-59, he just closed the school altogether. So students who went to Central High School in the 57-58 school year couldn't go to Central High School in 58-59. So either you had a year off from school or you had to find another school in the Little Rock area to go to. So that's going to be to keep the schools from desegregating or integrating in that 58-59 time frame. Now we'll move on to the Greensboro and Nashville sit-ins. Now the Greensboro, well, the sit-in movement is going to start really with this Greensboro, North Carolina issue. Now the Greensboro 4 are these 4 guys right over here. These will be 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who decide that to take it upon themselves to sit at a segregated lunch counter. So across the South, if African Americans wanted to eat at a restaurant or diner, they generally had to pick up the food and take it with them. It's kind of like the COVID-19 era. So basically, the way we dine today, where the only option is to go in, pick up your food, and leave, that was the option African Americans had at that time. They could not come in and sit down and enjoy a meal unless they went to a segregated business for blacks only, basically, or whites would not attend. So these 4 students challenged this. They do this February 1st of 1960. This movement's going to spread. So within the next 4 or 5 days, you're going to have like 300 students trying to integrate lunch counters across Greensboro, North Carolina. Again, by the end of February, cities across the South are going to be doing this exact same thing, including Nashville. So by the end of July of 1960, Greensboro will, at least the Woolworths, which they go to, will desegregate their lunch counter. So it'll take a few months, but it winds up being successful. What we're going to see in Nashville is going to be a more organized effort. So these Greensboro 4, right, these guys just kind of take it upon themselves, and others kind of build upon their effort. Not really well organized. In Nashville, Tennessee, we're going to see this organized effort in which you have this guy named James Lawson. James Lawson is going to basically train young adults, mostly college students. A lot of them went to Fisk University, including Diane Nash. So make sure that you know John Lewis and Diane Nash both went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Fisk is F as in Frank, I, S as in Sam, K, Fisk University. So Lewis and Diane Nash both went to Fisk. They were both part of this Nashville sit-in movement. This will start just 12 days after the Greensboro sit-ins. They are trained by James Lawson. When I say trained by James Lawson, basically what they're doing is they're going to a classroom, and in the classroom they will sit down as though they're sitting at a lunch counter, and then people are going to put out like cigarettes in their head and shove them off their seat, call them all kinds of bad names, throw drinks at them, basically just abuse them. And James is doing this to kind of teach them this Gandhi-like approach to this civil disobedience, or this nonviolent disobedience. So they're going to be training for this. That way, when they actually go to the lunch counter and somebody rips them off their seat, they don't fight back. And if somebody pours a drink at them, they don't fight back. If somebody puts a cigarette in their head, you don't fight back. You're going to have basically people replacing people, right? Somebody gets ripped off their seat, another student's going to go take that same seat that the first one was ripped off of. Right? They're all going to be training to do this in Nashville, Tennessee. So it winds up being a widespread movement. Within about 2 months or so, a little after 2 months, a lawyer who was also a city councilman in Nashville, an African-American guy named what was his name? Alexander Luby, I think. Alexander Luby was the city councilman or lawyer that was, his home was bombed. He wasn't there. He didn't get killed, but his home was bombed. And what that does is it encourages all these students to march to City Hall. So 2,500 young adults are going to march from Luby's home over to City Hall, and they'll confront the mayor. They press the mayor and ask him for his own opinions, because anywhere in Nashville, Tennessee, if you go downtown, there was no place for African Americans to actually sit down and enjoy a meal. They had to get their meals to go. So the mayor finally says, yes, I think this is wrong. You guys are right. There should be places for African Americans to sit. And within the next few weeks, City Council is going to agree. So by the time we get to May, Nashville has then been desegregated. So Nashville, Tennessee becomes the first southern city to fully desegregate lunch counters across the city. So make sure you know that. Nashville is the first southern city to fully desegregate the lunch counters in the South. Now, from this movement, we're going to see a woman named Ella Baker. Now, Ella Baker is going to be this woman that we're going to see on the next slide. This is Ella Baker. Now, Ella Baker is a very significant woman in African American history, maybe one of the most significant women in African American history. Ella Baker, first of all, worked for the NAACP starting in the 1930s through the mid-1950s. So she was there for almost 20 years, and she was a high-ranking member of the NAACP. She's really involved in that organization, had a lot of power herself in that organization. And then once we get to the rise of Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker decides that she's going to go to join the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I mentioned the SCLC, but on the previous slide, you saw the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That is Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization. After that Montgomery bus boycott, he goes back, meets with the other, like, basically church leaders, and they create this civil rights organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So Ella Baker joins that organization, leaves NAACP, joins the SCLC, and then after a few years there, she sees what's going on with the sit-in movement, and she decides to help organize these students across the South, basically thinking there's power in numbers. So she leaves the SCLC, and she helps create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now we're going to call that SNCC. So when we get to this term over here, let me go to this slide. You'll see the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So that organization is going to be, in part, formed by Ella Baker. So Baker becomes very significant. Now, Baker's probably a person that you're not going to hear very much about. She was not the person that's going to speak in front of the cameras very often. She's generally not going to be the one that's going to be ripped off of bar stools. Basically, what she's doing is going around city to city, college to college, community to community, and she's gathering troops, right? She's recruiting people to do this work. Now, again, when I look at the African American civil rights movement in the early 1960s, I really think of this mass movement of young adults as being really the key, in my opinion, and you don't have to share this opinion with me, the key to the movement itself, right? If you don't have thousands of young adults who are ready to sacrifice themselves and sacrifice their time and sacrifice their health and their safety for the cause, you don't have the movement at all, right? Martin Luther King Jr. in and of himself is only going to take it so far. You have to have the soldiers, like a general with no troops. If you have a general with no troops, there's no way you're winning the war. But you have those troops. Even without a general, those troops can inflict some damage. And really, Martin Luther King Jr. is not even the general, right? He's going to kind of swoop in at the end of some of these issues and then take the TV, and he becomes this big hero. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the Selma Montgomery marches. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is going to be very powerful. Possibly the most influential and most significant civil rights organization of the early 1960s for African Americans. But it's going to start in 1960, again, building off of this sit-in movement and organized by Ella Baker. So Ella Baker is very important in building up the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now we'll move on to the Congress of Racial Equality. Now, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC are going to have a lot of the same members. So a lot of the people that are in SNCC are also in CORE and vice versa. So the Congress of Equality organizes what we call these freedom rides. These freedom rides will involve African Americans and whites riding on buses across state lines, right? Because you're going to have southern states where you'll have mandated segregation, and northern states you won't have that legalized segregation. So what they're going to do is they'll start in a state, they'll get on a bus together in a state where it's legal to sit together, and take the bus across state lines to states where it is illegal, where you have these legalized segregation. So your first freedom rides will start early in 1961, really by May of 61, so the first half anyways of 1961. So let's go over here. This is going to show us a map of the freedom rides. Your first freedom ride is going to start way up here in Washington, D.C. You're going to take this line down all the way to Rock Hill. It's fairly uneventful until they get to Rock Hill. Once they get to Rock Hill, South Carolina, though, African Americans on the bus attempt to use a white bathroom, and they get attacked. John Lewis was one of those riders. John Lewis was going to be a leader of SNCC. He's going to be a very significant leader in SNCC. And those who follow politics today may know John Lewis, because John Lewis has been a U.S. rep from the state of Georgia for the past 30-something years, at least since the 1980s. He's been there for a long time. He's getting up in age, of course, now. he's still around and he's still a legislator. He's still in the United States House of Representatives. So he's going to be attacked along with others in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Now, that doesn't stop them. They get back on the bus, and they go all the way down to Anniston, Alabama. So now we're going to take this trip down to Anniston. Sorry, trying to get my pointer on my YouTube one as well. We'll get down to Anniston. And once we get to Anniston, then you're going to be in Alabama. Alabama and Mississippi are going to be two of the most dangerous states. Really, Mississippi is going to be the most dangerous. Alabama will be very dangerous as well, though. Once they get to Alabama, you're going to have people or police who promised to protect them not protect them. In fact, you're going to have leading police officers or troopers in the state actually contact the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and tell them when the bus won't be protected. And the Klan, in addition to other white supremacists in the South, take advantage of that window of opportunity. They throw a bomb into this bus and they blow it up. Now, when they throw the bomb in, it's going to be I think like a Molotov cocktail, so it doesn't blow up right away. Basically, the riders are able to get out of the bus, including the bus driver, and then it blows up and destroys the bus after that. Right? This is going to be the leading of violence. This means that first trip, this first freedom ride, is going to end in Alabama. Now, again, nobody was killed. And the reason I have this Boynton versus Virginia case up here is because the freedom rides are building upon this court case, Boynton versus Virginia. Boynton versus Virginia said that interstate buses cannot be segregated, and interstate facilities as well. So that means when you go to a bus station, you can't have bathrooms that are segregated. So Boynton versus Virginia was already decided in 1960, which leads up to these freedom rides in 1961. Basically, this is saying that the Supreme Court has made a decision, but now we need to make sure that the executive branch or states or police are going to actually support that decision, right? A Supreme Court decision in and of itself is useless if there's nothing to support it from the executive level, right? That's why you have these three different branches of government. Now, I'll just mention this real quick because I don't want to spend too much time on this. But CORE, remember the Congress of Racial Equality, make sure you know that, organized that first freedom ride. Now, it ends in Alabama, right? You see the trek end in Montgomery. One of the buses gets away, but once that bus driver sees what happens to the other bus, he says, okay, I'm done, we're out of here. So they stop that ride. In response, you're going to see a movement come up from Nashville. So the next ride is going to come up from Nashville, and that's going to make their way down to Montgomery. Basically, this is going to be Diane Nash leading the movement, saying, hey, since Congress of Racial Equality couldn't complete this, we're going to try to finish it for them. The problem is they don't get the police protection either, and it's not going to end successfully either. But you're going to see kind of just a series of bus rides in 1961 where they're challenging these states and these segregation laws. So John Lewis is involved, Diane Nash is there, Ella Baker, of course, she's going to be involved in this. On that first Nashville ride, we're also going to introduce a guy named Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was like, I think 18 or 19 years old. We're going to bring Stokely Carmichael back up again. In fact, you're going to read Stokely Carmichael for that primary source assignment. So you'll get to know Stokely Carmichael and his opinions a little bit better as time goes by. But we'll mention him again. Now we'll get to 1963. We're still looking at school desegregation. This time we're looking at the university level, and specifically at the University of Alabama. So University of Alabama admitted or accepted their first two African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. Vivian Malone and James Hood have been accepted to the University of Alabama, but the Alabama governor, a guy named George Wallace, that would be this gentleman right over here, grandstands and says that there's no way he's going to allow Vivian Malone and James Hood to enter the U of Alabama administration building. Keep in mind, this is back in the 1960s. If you're going to register, you have to register in person, right? There's no going online and registering for classes. You actually had to go to a building physically, sign up, register, pay your bills, whatever you're doing. So George Wallace says, before Vivian Malone and James Hood are admitted, I'm going to stand in the schoolhouse door and protect our state's rights. That's going to be the mentality, kind of like that Orville Fallis mentality in Arkansas a few years earlier. So Wallace follows suit. Now, we know that school desegregation has already been put in place. We know that the executive branch of the government has supported African Americans when it becomes a big national issue. So sure enough, the United States Attorney General's office will tell George Wallace, you got to move out of the way. We're going to use federal troops, and we're going to protect Vivian, Malone, and James Hood. Now, Wallace, in his heart of heart, knew this was going to happen. So why did he do this? Well, he wants to run for president. So he's going to run for president a couple of times. We're going to bring George Wallace back into the conversation as we get into 1968 and 72 timeframe. But he's going to really make a name for himself in 1963 by becoming a hero to segregationists and state rights proponents in the mid-1960s. We'll briefly mention this Great March on Washington. This Great March on Washington had around 250,000 people, white and black marchers who convene and see a series of speakers. This march was really about getting jobs for African Americans. And we're talking about labor issues or jobs for African Americans in the 20th century. The main person you want to make sure you're acquainted with was A. Philip Randolph. We talked about A. Philip Randolph before. A. Philip Randolph was responsible for organizing this Great March on Washington. So he organizes the march. We have a series of speakers, one after another. We're going to be pushing for and supporting African American civil rights, especially when it comes to jobs. And at this event, Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech. You guys will be reading that speech as part of the primary source essay document. So I'm not going to say much more about that because you guys will actually read that pretty soon. Now we'll go to Freedom Summer. Now, Freedom Summer, I'm going to play a brief video for this also. So let me pull up my page real quick and make sure I've got the correct one.
In 1964, the movement.
Okay. And let me go over to you guys.
In 1960.
Okay. Okay, and I'll be sharing this video again just like I did a few minutes ago. Let me get my share application screen option up.
Before, the movement's use of nonviolent demonstrations had in one way or another successfully chipped away at the South's rigid tradition of segregation, but not Mississippi, a state where racism ran deep, and some Ku Klux Klansmen also wore the badge of law enforcement. In 1964, Mississippi was a state under siege. And if you were a civil rights worker, it was a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah, now, you know, going down there, trying to face a real situation that will occur, namely there will be a mob at the courthouse.
Organizers called it Freedom Summer, and its purpose was to enlist and train mostly white Northern college students as volunteers for a massive voter registration drive in Mississippi, where only 6% of eligible blacks were actually registered to vote.
We're here on legitimate voter registration business. It's our constitutional right to try to register. It's our constitutional right to come in the courthouse.
For the most part, Freedom Summer was the idea of this man, Bob Moses, a math teacher from New York City who'd been trying with limited success to register black voters in Mississippi since 1961. Over the years, he'd been beaten, shot at, and jailed. His friends were murdered for trying to register blacks.
Here we have this whole congressional district. The majority of the people eligible to vote are black, and hardly any of them can even go to try.
That's a section of the Constitution of the state of Mississippi.
In June of 1964, hundreds of idealistic college students converged on a small women's college in Oxford, Ohio, for orientation and training before being sent south. Here's a report filed at the time by NBC's Jack Perkins.
Because the project these young people have come here to be trained for is unorthodox, some of the training is unorthodox.
We want to get used to this, used to people jeering at us, and we also want the white students who are playing the mob to get used to saying things, calling out efforts, calling people niggers and nigger lovers.
James Foreman, Executive Secretary of SNCC, leads this maneuver. A group of students were praying an angry mob. They are supposed to jeer and curse, and that's all. But a mob, even a friendly mob, play acting, can get out of hand.
Okay. That was very good because you all got carried away, see? I mean, you were just supposed to yell and you started hitting us, so you got off your frustration.
After a week of this, they are ready to leave, remembering their warning.
You're going to be thrown in jail. You're going to be cursed, spit on, everything else.
With some knowledge of what may await them, but with little protection against it, they set forth for a summer in Mississippi. Jack Perkins, NBC News, Oxford, Ohio.
One of the young men attending that training session was Andrew Goodman, a student from Queens College in New York. His mother, Carolyn, still remembers the day her son told her he wanted to spend the summer in Mississippi.
All we knew is he was going to go and be trained, and we gave him permission. Why? Because we couldn't talk out of two sides of our mouths. We couldn't say this is a horror and say, well, it's okay for other kids, and it's certainly okay for black kids, but not for my white middle-class son. I don't want anything to happen to him. I don't want him to be beaten. I don't want him to be ending up in jail and so on. So off he went to Ohio.
Shortly before completing their training and heading south, a church in Neshoba County, Mississippi, was burned to the ground. The news was of particular interest to two of the Ohio trainers. Michael Schwerner from New York City and James Chaney, a native Mississippian, had helped establish a voter registration school in that church before coming to Ohio. Within hours of hearing the news, they decided to return to Mississippi. Riding in the backseat of their car was a raw recruit, Andrew Goodman.
He said, Mom, I'm going down to Mississippi to Neshoba, and he told me why. So I was a little nervous about that, but I didn't say anything. I just was upset about it because I had a feeling that something wasn't right.
They went into the state at the period where it was most roiled up and most dangerous, and there was no one else going in.
The next day, after visiting the ruins of the church, the men headed back to their home office in Meridian, Mississippi. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the trio was spotted by a deputy sheriff just inside the city limits. He arrested them for speeding.
They paid the fine and I released them and escorted them to their car.
There is some mystery and some fear concerning three of the civil rights workers, two whites from New York City and a Negro from Mississippi. Police say they arrested the three men for speeding yesterday, but released them after they posted bond.
For us, that means they're dead. Just like that. Yes. I mean, they're okay if they're in jail. They're not going to really, with all this attention and the Justice Department calling and asking, they're not going to kill them in jail. But if they release them, then we would know where they are, right, within an hour for sure.
Back in Ohio, Bob Moses had little time to mourn those he assumed were dead. He felt it was imperative to discuss the situation and the risks with the students who were about to go to Mississippi.
And as Mark Beck and I said, the kids are dead. No, they had to absorb. They were dead.
Remarkably, Moses says only one volunteer quit. A few days later, in Mississippi, a burned out car was discovered in a swampy area. But with no bodies found, the families and friends of the missing men continue to hold out hope.
As a parent of one of the 3 boys who are missing, I am making this plea to all parents everywhere, particularly to the parents of Mississippi. I want to beg them to cooperate in every way possible in the search for those 3 boys and to come forward with any information of any kind which will help in the search.
Rita Schwerner, wife of Michael Schwerner, also spoke to the press.
You know, something happened to them. They're being held somewhere, or something happened. And I am going to find the answer. If the federal authorities can do it, this is fine. But if all the federal authorities at the beck and call of the government are unable to do so, then I, as just one individual, will go down and attempt to do so. If this means driving every back road, every dirt road, every alley in the county of Minnesota, I will do it.
Shortly after the civil rights workers disappeared, NBC News aired a special report hosted by Frank McGee that not only counted the known facts of the case, but also offered viewers an unflinching look at the harsh realities of race relations in Mississippi.
It is hostile country with a hostile attitude towards civil rights workers. A report from John Chancellor, NBC News, New Orleans.
This is backwoods Mississippi, silent and suspicious. The silence and the suspicion is felt here at the county seat, Philadelphia, where Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were arrested for speeding. The concern in Philadelphia, Mississippi today, however, is not so much with civil rights workers who have come and gone, but with others on the way. This morning, 50 men signed up as volunteer auxiliary policemen under a plan formed weeks ago. The auxiliaries will be empowered to arrest civil rights workers. Not all the reaction to the invasion of the civil rights workers has been official. There have been, for example, 5 church burnings in a dozen days. All the churches were Negro churches. None of the fires of accidental origin, no arrest.
I got to Philadelphia, I think the day after we learned they were missing.
NBC News correspondent Richard Valeriani covered the civil rights movement throughout the South.
It's the scariest place you've ever been. I mean, I don't know, that hatred was almost palpable. Heavy summer Mississippi air, you could almost feel it.
In Washington, President Lyndon Johnson made finding the 3 young men a top priority. Teams of FBI agents were assigned to the case, and sailors from a nearby naval installation were called in to search for bodies.
It could be that it is a hope to attract attention on this effort of these groups that have failed, but that is something I do not know.
It's sorrow for any children, any youngsters whose parents do not insist that they stay away from other states, trying to tell the people of other states how to conduct their affairs because they do not know what it's all about. And it's pitiful that parents haven't trained their children in the way that they should have. They ought to stay at home and tend to their own business.
Tonight in Washington, the FBI announced the finding of 3 bodies in graves at the site of a dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers disappeared a month ago. The bodies were found in a wooded area about 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, where the young men were last seen. The 3, Andrew Goodman, James Cheney, and Michael Schwerner, were last seen the night of June 21st. The FBI said a search party of agents turned bodies late this afternoon while digging in thick woods and underbrush several hundred yards off Route 21. The agency said the bodies were being taken to Jackson, Mississippi, where an effort will be made to identify them and determine the cause of death.
I seem to remember that we were in the theater. We were at the theater and friends came and said, come back because they found the bodies buried under the Certain Dam.
Mrs. Goodman, are you optimistic about the ultimate solution of the civil rights problem in the United States?
All I can say is that if the people who have expressed their feelings most eloquently to us in these past weeks are any reflection of what I believe are the vast numbers of people throughout this country, I have great optimism.
As you know, lynchings in Mississippi are not uncommon. They have occurred for many, many, many years. Maybe this one could be the last if some positive steps were taken to show that people in this country have had enough, that they require that human beings be treated as human beings.
Feel any vengeance?
No. I feel a great deal of pity.
Well, you all know that I am Fannie Chambers, the mother of James Chambers. Y'all know what my child was doing? He was trying so hard to make a devil leave. And he had two fellas from New York. Had their own home and everything. Didn't have nothing to do. But they come here to help us. Did y'all know they come here to help us? They died for us.
Though the state of Mississippi never charged anyone with the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, 7 Klansmen, including Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, were eventually convicted in federal court on charges of violating their civil rights.
The future of the United States of America may well be determined here in Mississippi, for it is here that democracy faces its most serious challenge. Can we have government in Mississippi which represents all of the people?
There would be many more beatings, bombings, and jailings in Mississippi that summer of '64. But the Freedom Summer voter registration effort was a stunning success, registering thousands of new black voters and focusing the nation's attention on the issue of voting rights, an issue that would dominate the nation's headlines again in 1965.
Okay, let me get back up here again. I'm going to share my files again. You guys could see that video, okay? Is that right? That's interesting, Mr. York. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me pull this back up, get my other screen back up as well. And that tells a summary of that Freedom Summer issue, right? Bob Moses from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He's the one that organized it, so make sure you know who he is. I think Bob Moses was on the study guide. If we go back to my PowerPoint, share files. I'll mention something else real quick. Again, the bodies were lost, or they were killed basically on June 21st. I remember they were arrested for speeding. Move over here. They were arrested for speeding, put in jail until the end of the workday, basically. Cecil Price, the guy who arrested him, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So basically, he was holding them until all of his buddies were off work. He let them go, and then they followed him with a patrol car, pulled them over to the side of the road. They almost immediately shoot and kill Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. Pull my video back up. And then after killing Schwerner and Goodman, they then chain whip James Cheney. And after chain whipping James Cheney, they then castrated him. They cut off his body part. I'll just say that. So he's tortured, mutilated, and then he's shot a few times and finished off. They hide their bodies in kind of this earthen dam. When the authorities come out and they start looking for Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, they come across 8 other dead bodies first. So name 8 dead black individuals before they get to Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. Again, really showing how little effort the state is in trying to find missing black people. Now, most of the 8, if not all 8 of them, were involved in the Freedom Summer training as well, right? This voter registration program. So again, just really depicting how violent this whole issue is, and how brave you really have to be involved. We'll move on to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll mention that real quickly. This would end segregation in public places. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 will end segregation in public places. It also outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, sex, or national origin. Right? So it's going to outlaw discrimination based upon race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This will ban employment discrimination, and it'll create something called the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which of course is still around today, right? The EEOC. When you put in job applications, oftentimes it'll have some type of EEOC questionnaire that you have to fill out that will reveal gender or race if you want to reveal that information. That way, if you're not chosen for a job based upon your race, gender, or whatever, you can then file a lawsuit of some sort, right? So that starts with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is going to come back again when we talk about Mexican-American civil rights. Again, this will protect you based upon race and color. And this whole issue of what Mexicans were from 1848 after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo up until this point is going to be up in the air. Right? Legally, Mexicans are considered white, but after 1964, people who are of Mexican descent are generally going to say we are not white, we are brown, and we deserve protections based upon the color of our skin. So now they can be fighting for the brownness of their skin as opposed to the whiteness of their skin. We'll do the Selma Montgomery marches. Of course, some of you may have seen the movie Selma, so may be somewhat familiar with this. But basically, you're going to have a voter registration drive in Selma, Alabama. That's going to start in like 1961. Right? This starts from 1961, goes all the way up until 1965, and it's driven by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. So SNCC is organizing this. Now remember, SNCC is going to be, in part an organization that Ella Baker is really pushing. This is really student-driven, and again, it's the young adults that are going to be really important to this. Anytime we have mass movements, it's the young adults that are key, right? Responsible 30, 40, 50-year-old men really have a hard time making time for this, right? If I told my wife, hey, I'm going to go to Selma, Alabama for a few months and try to register voters while I've got 3 kids at home, I guarantee you my wife's not going to let me go to Selma, Alabama when I've got a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 4-year-old that she's going to have to take care of. Right? It just means more work for her, even though what I may be doing may be altruistic. There's other responsibilities I have to do, not to mention the fact that I have a job. But when you're 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, you don't have a mortgage yet, you may not have kids yet, and it's going to vary, of course. And you may not have all the responsibilities you're going to have later on in life, which means you have a lot more freedom to go where you're needed or wanted or where you can be important than somebody who's a little bit older, which is part of the reason why Ella Baker likes this. When you have organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, you have a bunch of 30, 40, 50-year-old men who are businessmen and preachers. And when you get up to the higher ranks of business, the business world, you tend to have a lot of meetings, right? Meeting after meeting after meeting, and they talk about all the things that they can do, and they really don't do what they're supposed to do. So you have to have those young, active troops out there doing the work. So SNCC is doing this from 1961 to 65, really on their own for the most part. But when we get to late 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. agrees to support it with his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So now the SCLC is going to be supporting SNCC. Now, in February of 1965, a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was part of this voter registration drive, was killed by a state trooper in Alabama. Now, he was shot and then dies 8 days later. So in response, these SNCC members, these activists, say they're going to march from Selma to Montgomery. They start marching. I'm going to go over to this next slide real quick. They start marching. The reason I want to show this slide is because here's Selma, Alabama over here. To get from Selma to Montgomery, you have to cross over this Edmund Pettus Bridge. And then you can take Route 80 all the way over to Montgomery. But the key is to get over to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, when the initial march is attempted, you're going to have 600 people try to take the march. They come to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, this first march is without Martin Luther King Jr. They come to the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, and they see a bunch of state troopers blocking the bridge. They don't know what the troopers are going to do, so they try to keep marching, and they wind up getting attacked. So they wind up getting basically pulverized with nightsticks during this Summit of Montgomery March. You can see the violence in that top right image. So 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. is called upon. He's going to lead the march. This time you're going to have somewhere around, 2,000 marchers behind Martin Luther King Jr. When Martin Luther King Jr. comes, then you know the cameras are going to come and the nation's attention is going to come, because now you have kind of this heroic figure kind of leading the march. And the same exact thing happens. Martin Luther King Jr. leading 2,000 people marches to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They see the state troopers blocking the bridge. They know what's going to happen if they try to make their way across the bridge. So instead of doing that, they all take a knee, say a prayer, and go back to the church where they started. So that's referred to as Turnaround Tuesday. Right? The first one's Bloody Sunday, where they get beat up. Turnaround Tuesday will be March 9th of 1965. But now the television networks are following this. The president at the time is Lyndon B. Johnson. And the week after this happens, Lyndon B. Johnson expresses support for the marchers. Ultimately, on March 21st, 1965, federal troops will be dispatched to protect the marchers. And now with the government's protection, they start the march and complete it 4 days later. So that will complete the Summit of Montgomery marches, and it's all about voting rights. Now, that will lead to the Voting Rights Act, right? So we have that Freedom Summer and the Summit of Montgomery marches are both about voting rights. Two different things happened to help voting rights in 64 and 65. In 1964, Congress passed, the United States ratified the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution will ban poll taxes. So poll taxes are now going to be gone after 1964. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which will essentially protect minorities' right to vote, protect everybody's right to vote. The way they're going to do this is basically oversee voting precincts across the South for the most part. So there'll be measures put in place to help protect voting rights, especially of African Americans, but other groups as well as we go along. Now, we've talked about the civil disobedience aspect. Now we're going to talk about the more aggressive response. We'll end with these three. Again, we may go a little past 10:50, so if you have to drop off at 10:50, I totally understand. But we should finish probably 11 o'clock, maybe even a little before that. So we'll start off, actually not in this order. I really should reorder this. I'll forget to. We're going to start off with Malcolm X. Malcolm X, we'll say a little bit about him. His birth name was Malcolm Little. His parents were Garveyites, right? We talked about Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. His parents were both followers of Marcus Garvey. Members of the Ku Klux Klan burned down his house when he was a kid. And supremacists also killed Malcolm X's or Malcolm Little's father. Malcolm X, or Malcolm Little, turns to a life of crime, and he winds up going to prison for a while. And while he's in prison, he converts to Islam. So he becomes a Muslim while he's in prison. When he gets out of prison, he says he is no longer Malcolm X. I'm sorry, no longer Malcolm Little. He is now Malcolm X. Of course, the reason this is because where do we get the name Little? Just out of curiosity, I want to see who wants to answer that. Where did the name Little come from as a family name for Malcolm X's family? Where did that come from? Who wants to put down the answer in the chat? Slaves. Well, slave owners, right, Mr. Jones? So the slave owner, at some point down the line, had the last name Little. So basically, the slaves were given the last name of the person that owned them, that may have beaten them and brutalized them and sold them. That's whose name you have. And when you have that family name, you think of that name as being something that you're honoring, right? You always want to have, or not everybody, but a lot of people want to have kids to carry on the family name, right? You hear that phrase all the time, carrying on the family name. That's part of the reason why having a son historically has been important, especially in the royal families, right? Having somebody to kind of carry that on. So Malcolm X says, I'm not going to use the name Little because Little was the name of a guy who used to beat, torture, maybe rape family members that I've had in the past. down the line. So I'm going to get rid of my last name. I'm going to put an X because I don't know what my last name is. I don't know what my surname is. And he adopts this Islamic faith because he believed that the Islamic faith represented Africa much more so than the Christian faith did. So he this Nation of Islam. Now, he was not the leader. He's a spokesperson. He's not the leader. The leader's a guy named Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is the name of the leader of the Nation of Islam. So he joins this organization, and he takes a much more aggressive stance in pursuing civil rights. Just to give you a sense of Malcolm X, now one of the documents that you'll be reading will be his ballot or bullet speech. So you will read a speech from Malcolm X as part of that primary source assignment that we have coming up soon. But I'm going to play a little bit of Malcolm X's clip. I think I have like 2 or 3 clips, so you get a pretty good idea of what he's all about. So let me share my screen again. Just a minute while I do that. Okay, so I'm going to get my YouTube on real quick too. Okay, all right, and let me go ahead and play these.
You have described the Muslim movement as a religious organization, and you've said that there are many misconceptions about your attitudes, related views. Could we press for a very simple answer to one question? Do you hate all white people?
I don't think it's a fair question. The white man doesn't even come into my attitude. Mr. Muhammad teaches us to love our own kind and let the white man take care of himself. For a white man today, sir, after kidnapping millions of black people from Africa, stripping them of all human characteristics and relegating them to the role of chattel or cattle or animals, commodity, merchandise that could be bought and sold at will, and then 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, using every type of deceptive method to further us into slavery, called second-class citizenship, I think that it would take a whole lot of nerve for white people today to ask Negroes, do they hate them?
It has been suggested also that this movement preaches a gospel of violence. That
no, the black people in this country have been the victims of violence at the hands of the white man for 400 years. And following the ignorant Negro preachers, we have thought that it was godlike to turn the other cheek to the brute that was brutalizing us. And today, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is showing black people in this country that just as the white man and every other person on this earth has God-given rights, natural rights, civil rights, any kind of rights that you can think of when it comes to defending himself, we should have the right to defend ourselves also. And because the Honorable Elijah Muhammad makes black people brave enough, men enough to defend ourselves no matter what the odds are, the white man runs around here with the doctrine that Mr. Muhammad is advocating violence when he's actually telling Negroes to defend themselves against violent people.
Well, Reverend Martin Luther King preaches a doctrine of nonviolent insistence upon the rights of the American Negro. What is your attitude toward this philosophy?
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken a people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved this throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they've taken off the white sheet, put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attacks of the Klan in that day.
And it is because of our effort
toward getting straight to the root that people oftentimes think we're dealing in hate. We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not only civil rights, but even human rights. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy. Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Muhammad, does he teach hate? You should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God gave you? And I, for one, as a Muslim, believe that the white man is intelligent enough. If he was made to realize how black people really feel and how fed up we are without that old compromise and sweet talk. Stop sweet talking. Tell him how you feel. Tell him what kind of head been catching, and let him know that if he's not ready to clean his house up, if he's not ready to clean his house up, he shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down.
Okay, sorry, I'll give that screen back up. Let me stop sharing and put my other file back up. So I play those videos in particular because I want to kind of show you what kind of speaker he was and what he really believed. He does support violence if someone's violent to you. He believed, for most of his life, he believed that white people tended to just be violent altogether. So let me pull this back up. There are plenty of quotes where he's basically says that white people are violent people, that really should not be turning the other cheek to people that are violent, because they're going to be violent no matter what. Even if you turn the other cheek, they're going to continue to be violent. Right? That's going to be basically Malcolm X's approach. So he's not calling on people to go out and attack people. But he's saying if somebody's a strike you, you better strike him back, and strike him back harder than they struck you. You want to make it so that they don't want to hit you because they know that you're going to hit them back. Now, Malcolm X, again, had this really anti-white personality, but he's going to kind of change a little bit in 1964. So in 1964, Malcolm X takes this pilgrimage to Mecca. And actually, this is going to be right after he left the Nation of Islam. So Nation of Islam is going to be an organization that he leaves. He has some disagreements with Elijah Muhammad, some personality conflicts. Malcolm X had very strong ideals. One of the things he didn't like about Elijah Muhammad, and you could say the same thing about Martin Luther King Jr., is that both of them were unfaithful to their wives. Elijah Muhammad had affairs with other people that worked within the Nation of Islam, other women who worked in that Nation of Islam. Martin Luther King Jr. also had affairs when he was out on the road. So he regularly cheated on his wife, and the FBI was actually following on a recording, basically Martin Luther King Jr. having relations with women while he's on the road, basically to use it as blackmail in the future if they ever wanted to kind of bring it back against him. Because people are kind of following Martin Luther King Jr. because he's kind of this religious, idealized figure. But if you can kind of stain his character by saying, well, he's not really that good of a person because he's cheating on his wife all the time, then maybe you can bring some detractors, right? So you're going to see Malcolm X leave the Nation of Islam. He doesn't really care for Martin Luther King Jr. very much for most of the time. He doesn't really care for Elijah Muhammad when we get to 1964. He'll take this pilgrimage to Mecca. If you're a Muslim and you have the means or ability to do so, at some point in your life, you're supposed to take this pilgrimage. Millions of people take this pilgrimage every year. and it's millions of people from around the world, which means it's going to be people who are all different races and colors. So when Malcolm X takes his pilgrimage, he sees that there's a lot of white people taking the exact same pilgrimage, and he gets along really well with them. So after this pilgrimage, he then decides that maybe not all white people are violent. Maybe there are actually some decent white people out there, some caring white people, and maybe it's just not the color of their skin that makes them violent. Maybe there are other circumstances. So when he gets back from that pilgrimage, he creates his organization, something called Muslim Mosque Incorporated. I believe that group is on the study guide, Muslim Mosque Inc. Muslim Mosque Inc. will be Malcolm X's organization. There will be some people who were following the Nation of Islam who are now going to follow Malcolm X instead of Elijah Muhammad. So now Malcolm X has become competition for the Nation of Islam. So in 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by a member of the Nation of Islam, a guy named Thomas Hagen, that we'll talk about again later on. So in 1965, Malcolm X is now killed by a Nation of Islam member. There are issues where perhaps federal authorities could have done something about that and did not. Same thing can be said of Martin Luther King Jr. when we get to 1968. But Malcolm X, again, is supporting this separation movement. At 64, 65, he's going to start saying, well, maybe we can kind of bridge this gap. He's only going to be around for like a year before he's killed with this new mentality. So he becomes a little bit easier, a little more passive in that last year of his life. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King Jr. is starting to become more radical, which is why after 1963, you never hear about Martin Luther King Jr., right? After 63, we get to mid to late 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. becomes more radical. He speaks out against Vietnam, and you're not going to really hear Martin Luther King Jr. very much on television, or see him on television, or hear him on the radio. So Martin Luther King Jr. is more radical. Malcolm X becomes less radical in the mid 60s. Now, Malcolm X will inspire a guy named Stokely Carmichael. Remember, Stokely Carmichael was in Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He will become leader of SNCC in 1966. And when he does that, he takes SNCC to a more aggressive stance. They are no longer going to be just letting people beat them up and spit on them and put cigarette ashes on their head. Stokely Carmichael is going to be pushing for more of an aggressive approach inspired by Malcolm X. He, in fact, creates his own political party in Alabama called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. Lowndes is spelled L-O-W-N-D-E-S. So he creates this organization. The image that's used to depict this party is a Black Panther. So a Black Panther is used to represent his political party in Alabama. He is pushing for now a Black Power movement. So he's not wanting to be integrated anymore. Now he just wants African Americans to have power on their own, because he doesn't feel like this movement that SNCC and CORE and the SCLC have been involved in is really going anywhere. And really what we want to do is take power ourselves. So he starts pushing this Black Power movement in 1966, and in response to that, we're going to see a rise of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party starts in Oakland, California, founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. So both of these guys are going to be founding members of the Black Panther Party, basically inspired by Carmichael. So Malcolm X inspires Carmichael. Carmichael then inspires Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. And this Black Panther Party is going to arm their members. They are going to defend themselves against the police and patrol the streets themselves to fight against any police aggression. And they will help some poorer families by providing like breakfasts for kids across the country. Now, when we get to the late 1960s, that Black Panther Party is also going to start moving more towards a communist approach, as did Stokely Carmichael. Actually, in 1967, Stokely Carmichael travels the world. He visits North Vietnam. He visits China. He visits Cuba. He goes to all these communist countries and basically aligns himself with those guys instead of American capitalism, right? And we've already talked about this idea of communism and civil rights. Stokely Carmichael is now grasping onto that. The FBI is now tracking Stokely Carmichael, following him. They've got this program called COINTELPRO, which is counterintelligence program. And they will basically harass him, follow him, record him, see everything he's doing, and he winds up just moving to Guinea. So he winds up moving out of the country, moves to Africa, lives there for the rest of his life, changes his name to Kwame Ture. You don't have to know the Kwame Ture issue. I probably want to ask you about Guinea. But that'll be the end of the aggressive approach that we'll talk about today. Hopefully you guys have a pretty good idea of what Malcolm X believed. Again, you're going to be reading his speech. I think we'll end there today. And next class period, we'll pick up with the Mexican-American civil rights. If you have any questions for me, feel free to send me an email. And I guess that'll be it. I guess I'll let you guys go for today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay healthy. And send me an email if you have any questions. All right, bye.